history of a struggle against such victimage and subjugation as the only feasible possibility. This leads to a fetishization of the Revolutionary Party and at the same time the privatization of government once the party ascends to power. Mbembe explains the contemplated dynamics of such privatization by suggesting, moreover, the politics just discussed have not simply opened the way to substantial alienation of the political sovereignty of African states. More decisively, they've created the conditions for a privatization of this sovereignty. Both the struggle to privatize state sovereignty largely overlaps with the concrete struggle to then privatize the means of coercion, because control of the means of coercion makes it possible to secure an advantage in the other conflicts underway for the appropriation of resources and other utilities formerly concentrated in the state. In other words, leaving aside variations from one sub-region to the other, one characteristic of the historical sequence unfolding in Africa is the direct link that now exists between, on the one hand, deregulation and the primacy of the market, and the other, the rise of violence and the creation of private military, paramilitary, or jurisdictional organizations. The third characteristic, fault of modes of African self-writing, is the destruction of tradition embodied in the idea that the proletariat is the only true class that can represent universal agency. Mbembe's critique of nativism would seem to run against any simplistic version of instrumental Leninism. However, Mbembe argues that nativism is too enmeshed in the narratives of victimization to offer a substantive philosophical or political resource that would undergird a rich, multifaceted vision of emancipation. The slogan of the Third International around the national liberation struggles of the 1960s was, "The tribe must die for the nation to live." So this is what we're referring to as instrumental Leninism. Lastly, for Mbembe, African philosophy relies on a fantasy of the West as the evil other that would free Africans themselves from any responsibility for the profound failures of emancipation that have characterized the aftermath of liberation struggles in Africa. How, in the light of this powerful critique that we take very seriously, can we defend Ubuntu as an activist ethic of virtue that must be taken into account for any kind of new practice of humanism? We enter to argue that at times, Ubuntu has indeed been used in a manner consistent with the fourfold critique issued by Mbembe. However, there are ways in which Ubuntu can stand against such critiques in the struggle to live by an activist ethic of virtue. To be clear, we agree with Mbembe that there are dangers to modes of African self-writing, but we want to argue that in the activist ethic of virtue embodied by Ubuntu, it may indeed be possible to give a complex, coherent voice to the progressive aims of a new humanism. For in Ubuntu, human beings are entwined in a world of ethical relations and obligations with all other people from the time that they are born. And this in South African ancestor practice means that the singularity of a human being is biologically marked by the umbilical cord being buried with the ancestors. So you will be buried next to your umbilical cord. So your biological journey goes from the burial of your umbilical cord all the way back, and you circle back and you are buried next to your umbilical cord. If you ask a Xhosa or Zulu speaking, or Swana for that matter, where are you from, they will tell you they're from where their umbilical cord is buried, which confuses a lot of English-speaking people. That, however, is only biological singularity, and the distinction is between biological singularity and ethical singularity, which is that we become a person only through the endless performance of being an ethical being with other human beings. The second bond, then, is not imagined as one of separate, atomistic, individuated livelihoods. Instead, the ethical, political, and moral inscription on each other's by all other people is fundamentally drawn from the fact that we are born into a language, a kinship group, a tribe, and a nation. But this inscription is not something that can be reduced to a mere social fact. That would be biological singularity. become into the world obligated to others, and in turn, these others are obligated to us. It's a profound misunderstanding of Ubuntu to confuse it with simple-minded communitarianism, or to think that it involves merely forgetting or forgiving the wrongs of the past. It's only through the engagement and support of others that we're able to realize a true individuality and rise above our biological distinctiveness into a person whose uniqueness is inseparable from the journey of moral and ethical development as a person. Ifeanyi Mendichie captures such an idea in the following passage. In the stated journey of the individual towards personhood, let it therefore be noted that the community plays a vital role, both as a catalyst and as prescriber of norms. The idea is that in order to transform what was initially biologically given into full personhood, the community of necessity has to step in, since the individual himself or herself cannot carry through the transformation unassisted. The approach to person in so-called traditional thought is generally speaking maximal, insofar as it reaches for something beyond such minimalist requirements as the presence of consciousness, memory, will, soul, rationality, or mental function. The project of being, or more accurately, becoming a purpose, because it's always a practice, it is believed is a seriously, truly serious project that stretches beyond the raw capacities of an isolated individual, and it is a project laden with the possibility of triumph, but also with failure. If a community is committed to individuation and the achievement of a unique destiny for each person, then the person in turn is obligated to enhance the community of mutual support. We can understand then that our ethical relation to others is inseparable from how we are both embedded and supported by a community that is not outside of each one of us, but is inscribed alongside of each one of us, and indeed is inside each one of us. The ascription of the other also calls the individual out of himself or herself, back towards the ancestors, forward towards the community, and thereby brings about relations of mutual support for the safeguarding and enhancement of the potential inherent in every person as a singular being. The famous phrase in Xhosa, Umuntu, Gamuntu, Gabantu, literally means a person is a person by or through other people. Each one of us is called to become our own person, and also at the same time to realize and support an ethical quality of humanness in others, which is never defined because it's always a practice-oriented, future-oriented activity. And this becomes extremely important because we reduce humanism often to a set of capabilities. I worked for Sangoma for some time, and I said, do you think there's certain qualities for a human being to be a human being? And she said, for most of us, it's an ethical practice that takes on meaning on a day-to-day basis as we ethically become human in the endless set of conflicts that we're called to in any relationship to anyone. But we also want to define the human as widely as possible, and she was specifically referring to the decision to raise a child by 12 women, and this child had no spinal cord and therefore no functioning brain. And the decision was made because, as she said, the history of the struggle against black racism has always been in the name of the most inclusive possible notion of humanity that could be conceived, rather than the least inclusive. So the human isn't identified with rationality or even with Kasira as the making of a symbolic form, the mediation of all of our world through symbolic form. It is the human is a practice of other human beings, and who is included as part of that ethical practice. Therefore, that child was raised, a decision was made to raise that child by 12.